I am someone who knows what he's talking about. As from the bio that you've just been given, I can walk on water and not get my shoelaces wet, I guess. I also have 2 degrees in foreign affairs, and my last assignment at the Department of State was in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. So I know what I'm talking about, and I will try to keep to my daughter's advice to avoid jargon, terms of art, and slang that's not generally known amongst the general populace. I tend to do that, and I hope I don't do it today. But Wayne Madsen wrote a very nice introduction to my book, or a review of my book, and in it he says the 28 pages is essentially what Mike Springmann's book, Visas for Al-Qaeda, is all about. And he's right. And you're going to hear more about that from Jeff Steinberg and Les Jameson. But let me talk about my experience and what I saw from being in Saudi Arabia with the State Department and what I got out of my research for 2 years for my book. The website is www.michaelspringmann.com. And if you want to reach me, the email address is info@danapub, DAENAPUB.com. Now, what the United States did in the 1970s and 1980s was create a terrorist organization. It recruited the Mujahideen for the war in Afghanistan against the former Soviet Union. These were some of the worst possible people that the United States government and its repressive and reprehensible allies, such as Saudi Arabia and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Group, could put together. Cheryl Bernard, the wife of Zalmay Khalilzad, the former American ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, and the United Nations, said that we couldn't get the Soviets out of Afghanistan unless we got the worst possible people we could find to do it. And that's why you have no moderates, no leftists, no progressives, no nothing except crazy men in Afghanistan. And what the United States did after Afghanistan was form these people into a cadre, an Arab-Afghan legion, if you will, the people who were recruited from all over the Arab world and elsewhere, Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, to go and destabilize governments the United States didn't like, such as Yugoslavia, a socialist government that did not cooperate with America. It destroyed Iraq because Saddam Hussein was a secularist who didn't like religious fanatics in his government and didn't take direction from Washington. It did the same to Libya with Muammar Gaddafi. His country had the highest standard of living by UN measurements in Africa, and he went by the by because he was trying to control terrorists, and he would put them in jail or send them back to whatever country they came from. Same thing is happening today in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is a secularist. He has a government of many confessions, Christian, Shia, Sunni, and various other religions, and such as Druze, and he isn't cooperating with Washington, so he has to be removed. Now, how did this start? Very simply. I was in at the beginning in Jeddah in the late 1980s, and before I left Washington, the then American ambassador to Saudi Arabia had me in to meet him, and I figured it was going to be a 5-minute hello and goodbye session. And after that, I would go my merry way and go back to area studies or something like this. Well, Cutler spent 45 minutes telling me about all the problems my predecessor, Greta Holtz, had created for the American embassy in Riyadh. And he kept saying, well, she wasn't giving visas to rich Saudi women servants, and rich Saudi women can't travel to the United States unless they have hairdressers and seamstresses and other factotums to help them do it. I thought, this guy is telling me something, but I have absolutely no idea what he's telling me. But from what he's saying about my predecessor, she's going to make my career in the State Department. Well, after this was over, I talked to the economic officer from the Saudi desk, essentially the part of the State Department that follows affairs in Saudi Arabia and interprets what's going on in the country to the rest of the department. I said to him, what was that all about? And the guy said, I don't know. Walter Cutler is just a queer duck. Well, I got to Jeddah, and suddenly there was all this pressure to issue visas to people who had no ties either to the United States or to their own countries that would compel them to return from the United States after a visit. And I said, no, you can't go to America. We had a guy, for example, who was going to a trade show organized by the U.S. Department of Commerce, and he couldn't name the trade show, and he had no idea what city it was located in or where it was going to be held. And Paul arbitrate, a few minutes later, the clandestine service officer concealed in the commercial section called me up and said, I want a visa for this guy. And I said, no. And another hour after that, he called the chief of the section and got my decision reversed. And you can't do that. It's against the law and against State Department regulations. If someone wants to overrule a consular officer's decision, he has to have information that was not available to the consular officer when he made the denial. And he has to show it to the consular officer, and it has to be so persuasive that the guy can overrule himself. But no, it was not taken out of my hands. It was given to Justice Stevens, his given name, to overrule me and give these guys visas. And this went on for a year and a half. It was people that couldn't have the slightest idea where they were going. I had one guy come in, and he was going to the United States, and I said, well, which city? And he looks around the waiting room, and we had pictures on the wall of Detroit and San Francisco and New York. And he said, oh, I'm going to Detroit. And I said, no, you're not. But this went on. It got to the point where people would come to you with a stack of passports and say, you can issue the visas now, or I'll go to the Consul General J. Freres, and we'll have you overruled, and you can issue the visas then. And it was absolutely amazing. I complained to the head of the consular section, Justice Stevens. I complained to Stephanie Smith, the counselor for consular affairs in the capital, Riyadh, at the embassy. She advised me to go to Washington and complain to the Bureau of Consular Affairs, which I did. And nobody wanted to talk to me. Nobody cared. And I said, this is really strange, because this is clearly visa fraud of some kind or another. And I don't know whether somebody's being paid off. And I had tried to get a handle on what was going on before I went out to Jeddah by writing my predecessor, Greta Holtz. I sent her 3 letters saying, what's it like? What did you wish you had known before you got to Jeddah? And so forth. And never got a reply. And she came up to Jeddah from her next assignment, Sana'a in Yemen, and she told me, well, I was just too overwhelmed and too pressured and too uncomfortable to give you a real answer, which lasted for all of 15 minutes. I said, she's hiding something. Well, Greta, who is such a problem child, is now American ambassador to Oman after being a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. So this was a really strange thing, and I was eventually tossed out of the State Department, and I could never find out why. I said I wanted to find out under the Freedom of Information Act twice. The first time it went to a lawsuit, and it was sealed as a threat to national security. The second time, Reggie Walton, the judge in Washington, he was also on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, he simply shut the thing down saying you haven't exhausted all of your remedies, which I had in fact done. So what was all this about? Well, I ran into Joe Trento, a journalist, while doing some research in an article I was trying to write, and Joe told me that, well, basically what they were doing was recruiting for the Mujahideen. The CIA and the State Department were working with Osama Bin Laden to get people from all over the Arab world, all over the Muslim world, and bring them to Washington for training and debriefings and whatever, and then send them on to Afghanistan to kill Soviet soldiers, blow things up and shoot things down, hopefully with Ivan inside. Well, that explained everything. And I said, my God. And as time went by, I kept writing articles, I kept speaking out, I was invited to various organizations to talk to them about what went on in Jeddah, and got nowhere. And after the second Freedom of Information Act request was shot down, I decided I'd write the book on the screen behind me. And I drew on my experience, 2 years worth of research that I conducted, plus interviews with knowledgeable people, to put this together and to say, well, the United States created the Mujahideen. It then rebranded them as Al-Qaeda, and then it rebranded them again as ISIL or ISIS or Daesh or whatever you want to call it. But these people were being recruited by the American government. As far as the Mujahideen went, there were 52 recruiting offices in the United States, including Washington, D.C. But nobody can tell me any more about it. I go to officials in the government and say, hey, talk to me. I mean, it's been 25 years now. Aren't you a little bit uncomfortable about what's happened? Did you see this at the beginning when you started doing this? Dead silence. I mean, I dealt with the people in Jeddah. I wrote Greta Holtz, no response. I wrote Henry Encher, who works for the Central Intelligence Agency and was rewarded by an ambassadorship to Algeria. I contacted other people. The head of the CIA station, Eric Qualkenbush, well, dead silence. Nobody wants to talk to me. But I laid it all out in the book. I name names. In fact, one journalist in Washington said it's a dangerous book because it names names. And I show who was involved, how it was done, and where these people are now, as best I could find out. And the book is selling. The CIA hasn't been to my door like Wayne Madsen. I do have problems with an awful lot of spam on my email and on my telephone. But so far I'm not in jail, and nobody's wrestled me to the ground and tasered me, so I figure I'm ahead of the game. So I think my time is just about up. They're going to haul me off the stage with a hook, and if I don't do it and shut up and go on and let Wayne and Jeff and Les talk, they won't invite me back again. So I've enjoyed the privilege of speaking to you. You've been a great audience. You actually laughed at some of the things I said. So thank you kindly, and I hope to see you again. And let's go forward and make these people accountable for what they do. Thank you.